Hi. So it's been a while. The school year has kept me real busy, but I was going to try something today that I wanted recorded. So I figured if it was interesting enough to share, I would upload it, and we'll see how it goes. As a lot of you know, I'm a gardener. We've just moved into a new home, so I haven't had the chance to garden yet. If you could see behind me, you can see that the yard isn't exactly manicured, but it'll be a work in progress, and perhaps I'll share some videos on that as work progresses. But in the meantime, I've been working with the property and trying to figure things out, how to make things more environmental. I've got my hot compost going on up on the hill, which is great for dealing with yard waste, all the leaves that are falling from our gigantic oak trees, lawn clippings, things like that. I also have a couple worm bins, which is great for vegetables and cuttings that come out of the kitchen. Now there's a third type of waste that is a little harder to deal with. And you probably know what I'm talking about, the stuff that you find in the back of your fridge, or the meat cuttings that come off the plate, the stuff that you usually just scrape off into your garbage. Now what happens is that goes into your garbage can, gets hauled off, dumped into a landfill where it's buried, and it starts to degrade in an anaerobic environment. Now in that environment, the bacteria that are predominant are methanogens, and it generates natural gas, which is a huge greenhouse gas. So trucks drive around picking up all of our garbage, drive off to the landfill, generating greenhouse gases, dump it in the landfill where it further generates greenhouse gases. So if we can eliminate that source of waste, we can eliminate some greenhouse gases and perhaps provide more nutrients to the soils in our homes. Now I have to admit, I've thought about trying this before, and I've always been a little bit scared, because what I'm going to do is essentially leverage a different type of anaerobic bacteria to break down those scraps of meat, even some chicken bone, eggshells, things like that, that I can't put in my other types of composting here at home. And if you've ever tried to degrade things anaerobically, if things go bad, things go really bad. It can be very stinky. But I'm going to give it a try. I'm finally going to take the leap and give this a try. So why a third type of composting? Why can't I just take my meat scraps and eggshells and whatever waste from my refrigerator and leftover meals and put them into my compost pile up on my hill? Well, primarily because rats and mice would get to it long before it ever broke down into any sort of usable compost soil. Similarly with my worms, I could try putting them, I chopped them up real nice. I could try putting them in my worm bin. They might break it down after a while, but it would probably get pretty gross first and probably attract maggots and things like that before the worms are able to get to it, right? So keeping in mind with these processes, we need to live with them. We need to make our lives as not only healthy, but as pleasant as possible. I don't want to deal with maggots every time I go down into my worm bin. So we're trying to try a third type of composting. What we're going to do is leverage what's called the lactic acid cycle. Whether you know it or not, this is something you're already familiar with if you've ever exercised before in your life. Your muscle cells, when you're exercising really hard and they're exceeding the amount of oxygen that you're able to breathe in, will switch to something called the lactic acid cycle to continue generating the energy you need on a short-term basis. Right? And after a while, you'll get lactic acid buildup in your muscles. Right? If I run really hard, this happens to me, and I wake up the next morning and my legs are really sore and I need to stretch and massage them out. That's because of lactic acid buildup in your muscles. Well, there are bacteria and other microorganisms that live this way permanently. They leverage the lactic acid cycle to survive. So we're going to use those types of microorganisms as opposed to the aerobic respiratory microorganisms that we use in our hot box or in our hot compost pile. The good news is we can do it at a very small scale. So as I experiment, I can try different things. I won't have a huge pile of stuff. I'll have a small bucket of material. So this doesn't generate the methane that comes from a landfill. In fact, we use these lactobacilli, is what they're called, in a lot of our food stuff, to make yogurt, to make cheese, sauerkraut, if you're into that. So this isn't a new technology. This has been used for thousands of years for different purposes. Only this time we're going to use it intentionally to break down food waste. All right, so we're going to walk through the process. Now what I'm going to do is more of a home build type process. You can buy kits. They cost around $50 to $60. Me being me, I'm not going to spend that kind of money, just in case it doesn't work out. If it's something I don't want to do, I don't want a $60 piece of equipment lying around never being used. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through what I've done to do a little home build and see how it works over the next couple weeks. Okay, so for my little do-it-yourselfer Bokashi, and I should get into that a little bit. What we call this type of decomposition is Bokashi. It was implemented, I think, in Japan back in the 80s, but that's what this is called, so I'm referring to it as Bokashi. So to set up my little home Bokashi kit, everything I had was already around the house. It was very easy. I already had these 2 buckets. First thing I wanted to do was drill some holes in the bottom of the bucket that will be on the inside. Right? As this process goes, it's going to generate some liquid, so we want that to drain out. Otherwise, things get pretty foul. Okay, so I drilled some holes in the bottom of my bucket. Pretty simple. Now this bucket is going to sit inside a second bucket. And it's good if they're the same type of bucket so that they fit snugly. Remember, this has to be an anaerobic process. And ultimately what you're going to need is a sealing lid. So when you buy your buckets, make sure you're one of the type that has the O-ring around, so it's a sealing lid. Okay, so let's get started. Oh, and the other thing I did, I marked out 1-inch increments on the inside of the bucket. And that'll just help me measure out my proportions as I go without having to fiddle with scales or anything like that. Okay, so here's how I'm going to set it up. We'll see if this works. Again, this is trial and error. I've never done this before. Have a piece of old t-shirt. I'm going to lie this on the bottom of the bucket. So the liquids will go through, but none of the solids will go through. And so it's a little bit bigger than the whole bucket, so it'll creep up the sides a bit. Okay, that just needs to lie flat on the bottom. And I presume this will degrade over time. It is just a cotton shirt, so it is just an organic material. Now, here's the only thing I had to purchase. So this is what's called Bokashi Bran. And this is just wheat and rice bran. So the outer skin, after wheat and rice is done being processed, usually used as animal feed, sometimes as a dietary supplement. In this case, they mixed it with some molasses and inoculated it with the type of bacteria that we want to use for this. So it's specifically called Bokashi Bran, and it's made specifically for this purpose. After a while, if this turns out to be something I want to continue doing, it is possible to make this at home, and perhaps that's something I'll try, but I just bought this bag of it. So, and brand new, you can see me unseal it, first thing. Okay, and as I understand this, I'm supposed to start with quite a bit at the bottom. So I've got my tablespoon measure here, and I'm going to put about 4 tablespoons sprinkled across the bottom. Now there's no such thing as using too much, and there's definitely a such thing as using too little. So I'm going to start out probably with more than I need, and as I learn the process, I'll get better at my measurements. Okay, so nice healthy layer on the bottom there. Now the rule of thumb is for every inch of food waste that I put in, I'm going to want to put about 2 tablespoons on top of each of those layers. Hence the 1-inch measurements on the inside of the bucket. Okay, so here's some food waste I've been storing up for about a week. So I've got some coffee grounds, some mushrooms, some asparagus stems, and even some old hunks of ham that got stuck in the back of the fridge and forgotten about. So I'm just going to loosely spread this stuff around here. Some orange peel. Now the nice thing with this is I don't have to worry about stirring it or blending it. In fact, the less disturbed it is, the better. So once I have it in here, I just leave it here. I just let it sit. I don't want to do anything to it. Now I can even put things like eggshell and bone, right? Eggshell and bone are just mostly calcium carbonate, which dissolves in acid. And this bucket is going to be generating lactic acid. So when I'm all done, this eggshell should be more or less gone. We'll see about that. That's it in theory. So let's see how we did here. Okay, so that's a little over 1 inch on the side there. So I'll put a little more than 2 tablespoons. Again, I'll be overly generous with my first trial here and see how it goes. I'm going to sprinkle it liberally all across the top. This will also help keep the odor down. And in fact, one of the recommended usage of this brand is in litter boxes or other places that might get stinky, and it keeps the odor down. Okay, so between each application of food scraps, what I'm going to do, use an old plate and just compress everything down. Squish it down so it's nice and firm in there, and leave that plate in place, because remember, this is an anaerobic process. So we want to get as much air out of there as possible with each layer of food that I put down. And in fact, if you really want to be good about it, you would chop all your stuff up finely. I've even read about people putting it in a food processor to make it really finely chopped. I don't want to get into all that. If I wanted that much work, I would be doing something else. Okay, now I'm not going to seal this lid yet. I'm going to put it loosely there. When it's full, when it's all done, depending on how quickly I fill it up, that's when I'll seal the lid after the last application of the Bokashi. So it's been about a month since we started the Bokashi bin, and it's taken much longer to fill up than I anticipated. I think a couple things are happening. But first, let me back up. I'm reminded of when I got a new car, and it had a efficiency gauge on it. It told me what my fuel efficiency was at any given time. And based on that, I would change how I was driving, sometimes subconsciously. I think something similar is happening here. When we see all of the food waste in a bag in our fridge, then we're aware of it. And I think that awareness has led us to cut down on our food waste, which is a great thing. But it has taken a while to fill up the bucket. We started this the weekend before Thanksgiving. Now it's the week before winter break for school. So it's taken almost a month, but I think we're finally there. We're finally going to top this off and be able to set it aside to finish the process. So as you can see, the bin is nearly full. We're about 4 inches down from the top. So I'm going to pull this off. And you can see the type of waste that's been going in here so far. A little more vegetable waste than I would like to. Usually that goes into the worm bins, but I've really been trying to top this off so we can finally get it set. Okay, so hopefully this is the last bag that will do it. Okay, so this has been the method so far. This bag has been in the fridge, and throughout the week we add to the bag. That way I'm not opening up the bucket too often. Remember, this is an anaerobic process, so you want to keep as much air out of here as possible. And if you're just opening it up every day and adding stuff to it, it's just going to constantly get more oxygen into it. We need that not to happen. All right, so I'm just going to add this in. Hopefully this will be close enough to top off. If not, I will try something to give it an artificial top, but I think we're looking pretty good here. Yeah, this will top it off. Give it a good mashing, because we don't want any air in the middle of it either. The less air we have, the better this process is going to be. If we get air in there, things are going to get pretty gross. Okay, so I'm going to mush it down. This time I'm gloved up, so I have no problem just jamming it in here. Okay, so we still have a bit of airspace, and that's okay. And indeed, as this process continues, this will continue to sink down and compress. So there's going to be more and more headspace here. So what I'm going to do, let's put a layer of shrink wrap over the top to help seal out some of that air. And use my plate here to give it one more good mashing down. Okay, that'll do. Now I think we're ready to seal it up, and we'll set it aside for 2 to 3 weeks, and we'll check on it then. So the other part of the process that I want to touch on is the leachate. The leachate is the liquid that is going to fall through. Remember, we drilled those holes in the top bucket to drain into the bottom bucket. The lactic acid process itself is going to generate a lot of liquid, plus the foods that we have in there tend to be relatively wet. So we need to capture that drainage. Now, interestingly, and something that surprised me, is the bucket of food itself isn't all that smelly. It smells like pickled food, really, with sort of a grainy odor from that Bokashi Bran. Now, the stuff that's draining out the bottom actually smells pretty terrible. And I'll have to do some reading to find out if that's normal or if that's something I need to worry about. Now, some people take that leachate and use that as a fertilizer. I don't have anything to fertilize, plus while I'm trying to figure out what the story with that odor is, I'm not sure I want to spread it anywhere to begin with. So what I've been doing is taking that liquid up into my compost piles and pouring it on there, because it is rich in micronutrients as well as microorganisms that are going to help speed up my biodegradation process in my regular compost bins. So that's what I've been doing with the fluid. Okay, so let's take a look and see how much we have in the bucket here. Yeah, that's actually quite a lot. Now that skim layer on top is a combination of microorganisms that have accumulated, plus some mildew and such. And it actually smells pretty bad. So I am going to take it up into the compost piles to drain it, put the other bucket back in, and I'll check it every 2 days or so to see how much is accumulated. Hopefully if I drain it out fairly regularly, this odor will go away as the things start to biodegrade. Alright, so I wanted to follow up on the Bokashi. It's been, so I have it labeled here, we started this bin on the 15th of December. It is now the 8th of January, so almost exactly 3 weeks. Now, I've tried to be patient. Dealing with this type of composting kind of goes against my nature. I love having the worm bins because I can poke around in there, check their moisture, see how the worms are doing, see what food they're into. But with this one, I've closed it for 3 weeks and left it sealed. The only thing I've been doing is pulling off the top bucket, taking the bottom bucket, pouring out the liquid that's formed up in my compost pile, and then putting it back together and letting it sit. So this will be the first time I've opened the bucket in 3 weeks, and I'm a little anxious about that. Usually I don't worry about gloves and such when it comes to stuff like this, but if things have gone bad in there, it's going to be pretty gross indeed. So just check it out. All right. Alex, brace yourself. If things have gone bad, this is not going to smell good. Okay, I'm popping the seal now. Nothing's exploding, that's good. Okay, interesting. Alright, so what I have to say. So, as I've been releasing the liquids, that has smelled pretty bad, pretty rank. Less and less so as time has progressed. And as I stick my nose in there, and you saw me stick my face right on in there, there's no smell at all. Now, this is more or less what I expected. It looks like solid food. Nothing has really changed. And from what I've read, that is what I would expect. That this isn't really a composting, it's a pre-composting. Essentially what I'm doing is pickling the food waste, so that when I do put it in my compost pile, it's going to degrade much faster. Now what I'm really curious to see is when I actually dump this out and see it in my compost pile, what the food actually looks like, and then track and see how quickly it disappears. The microbes and even the macroorganisms that get to it and eat it, it's not going to obviously disappear. That's going to be the curious thing. Now, what's holding us back is it is early January and it's quite cold. So all these biological processes are going to be slowed down as the food degrades in my compost pile. So it's not going to be a true measure. But I'll try it again. That should take us into spring, and we'll see how it goes then. Okay, here we are at the other side of my yard, in my yard waste compost piles. These are just general waste compost, really easy to do. We're going to see how it works when I add Bokashi to it. Now when it comes to the Bokashi, from what I've read, you could just bury it in your yard, and it'll decompose very quickly there. I don't have any beds that are ready for that yet, so I'm just going to put it in my compost pile and add it as just a nutritious addition to the pile. So all I'm going to do is pull aside the top layer, make a nice hole for it, interestingly, typically a compost pile would be relatively warm, but this has been sitting here for a while, and the weather's been so cold that it's not really warm at all. Now, like I mentioned before, every couple of days I've been dropping the liquids out of the bottom bucket. Now, if I had saved that, I could dilute it with water, and apparently it's a pretty potent fertilizer for a garden. Again, so I don't have a garden yet. I'm going to do this. Okay, and let's see what happens when I drop this in. Okay, everything is pretty much 100% recognizable. As advertised, nothing has changed. I can still see whole chunks of pumpkin in there. I can see some turkey bones. Nothing has altered at all. Actually, I'm kind of curious. What is the state of the bones? Right, here's a turkey bone from Thanksgiving. Still hard as a rock. So nothing seems to have really degraded when it comes to that. It does concern me a little bit. Okay, I'm going to spread this out a little bit. Let's see how this goes. Cover it all back up. And I'm going to put a fresh layer of leaves on that from the pile of fall leaves that I'd saved. Alright, we'll come back in about a week, see what that looks like, see how it's degraded. Again, in this cold weather, I don't expect for it to be degrading very quickly, but for the sake of curiosity, I'm going to give it a check and see what it looks like. It's been about a week since I buried the results of the Bokashi bucket into my compost pile. The plan was to take you guys up there, show you what had happened, but a couple things got in the way. Primarily, nothing much happened, and that wasn't totally unexpected. It's really cold right now in Northern Virginia. Every night is getting well below freezing. So I wasn't expecting a lot of microbial activity in my compost pile until spring. Typically what you would see from what I've seen from other people doing Bokashi is worms would permeate the compost pile and really dispose of that food waste quickly. What happens is apparently foxes and raccoons permeated my compost pile and disposed of that waste. So there really wasn't much to show you. But that in itself was telling. The idea is the pre-compost isn't supposed to be that appealing to animals, but this was still. So that tells me I probably didn't let it sit long enough. The 3 weeks probably wasn't enough time to really get things broken down in here. So for next time I try this, I'll know to go a bit longer. And that begs the question, am I going to do this again? Yes, I think I'll give it another try and do things a little differently. First thing, it took way too long to fill up this bucket. I got my Bokashi Bran towards the end of November. Even with our Thanksgiving leftovers going into here, a portion of my son's jack-o'-lantern going into here, it still took almost a month to fill up this bucket. And that's way too much air getting in there. What you really want to do is fill this up as quickly as possible and then let it sit, having been sealed from all the air. Right? Every time you open it, you're reintroducing air. So there's way too much opening it as I was generating little bits of food waste. The good news is apparently the family doesn't generate that much food waste. Most of it was going into the worm bins and not into the Bokashi, and that was another part of the problem. I currently have 3 worm bins going, and so most of the vegetable waste is going into there. Now, as the schools reopen, as people get vaccinated to COVID, life will return to normal. 2 of my worm bins belong to the school. I've just been taking care of them. So once that happens, perhaps I can fill up my Bokashi bucket quicker. So we'll try those things. Now, if there's something I was going to change, what I might do is drill a spigot hole at the bottom of the drain bucket. Having to pull out the top bucket to carry the wastewater someplace to dispose of it was a little inconvenient. So to make things more convenient and to avoid reintroducing more air every time I pulled the bucket out, I may add a spigot hole. And if you get the store-bought versions of the Bokashi bucket, they generally have a nice little twist spigot or push spigot that you can just drain all that leachate out very easily. So we're going to give this another try. I may not show you the process beginning to end. I may just show you the results and summarize the changes. Was it a success? I'm not sure, which is why I'm going to try it again. It certainly wasn't a failure. It is a good outlet for the food waste that I generally can't compost. We just don't generate enough of that stuff. So until I can get some more vegetable matter going into here to really fill this up quickly, it's going to be difficult. So we'll follow up. maybe going into spring, and then when I bury it into my compost pile, things will be nice and warm, and things will break down as I would anticipate they would. So stay tuned for another try, but that's the summary of my first effort with Bokashi.